the stressing of the immune system of the habitats in which we live, the thinning of soils, and the loss of biodiversity. All those things play into the same game. So the research results came back, and a mushroom that we found that I focused on for many years called agarikon, first described by Dioscorides in 65 AD as a treatment against consumption, now known as tuberculosis. Indeed, it is active against tuberculosis. Agaricon's Latin name is Fomitopsis officinalis. It's exclusive to the old-growth forests of the Northwest, Washington, Oregon, Northern California, British Columbia. It is now thought to be extinct over most regions of Europe, where it was first described over 2,000 years ago. When I sent in samples of this to the BioShield Biodefense Program, we have got extremely strong hits against pox viruses, orthopoxes, which includes variola, smallpox. And this came as quite as a surprise. And we sent in many replicates. I think we have 31 reproducible results to date. And we have been selected as having the 2 of the top 6 hits against smallpox, like viruses, were chosen by the BioShield program. 2 of those 6 were my samples of Fomitopsis officinalis. Now, it's not the wood conch that you boil in water, which is the traditional Chinese and European method for making teas. The wood conchs we boiled in water were not active, so people shouldn't go out and collect this really rare mushroom. It's extremely rare. We need to preserve its biodiversity. But it's the Mycelium that I grew in a specialized way in the laboratory. We have now 13 strains of this species in culture. The BioShield program has 10. We sort of hit the big home run. The BioShield program was very excited because they were hoping that they would find something unexpected and novel to science. The readers and listeners may not realize that Americans have not been vaccinated against smallpox since 1980, and most Americans since 1968. And as a result, everyone born after those dates have no immunological defense against pox viruses. In 1942, a lady in Peoria, Illinois, sent in a moldy cantaloupe to a U.S. government laboratory in response to the U.S. government's plea to Americans to send in their moldy fruit. And the reason being is they're looking for new strains of Penicillium, because even though Alexander Fleming got the Nobel Prize in 1927, 1928 for Penicillium chrysogenum's inhibition of staph bacteria, Staphylococcus aureus, the strains that had been discovered up to 1942 could not be industrialized to produce commercial amounts of penicillin. So her moldy cantaloupe yielded a strain of Penicillium chrysogenum that produced 200 times more penicillin than any strain heretofore seen. It revolutionized and allowed the industrialization of penicillin. The Germans and the Japanese did not have penicillin. The Americans and Brits did. Obviously, it saved tens of millions of lives and helped tip the balance in favor of the Allied powers against the Axis powers in World War II. Well, agarikon, Fomitopsis officinalis, the mushroom that grows in the old-growth forest, does not enjoy the widespread habitat distribution that a cantaloupe does. And so as we have these shrinking habitats, and logically, if I have 10 strains of this mushroom or 100 strains of this mushroom, I'm going to find one strain that's going to be more active than the other ones. And we're already seeing that. And so we're trying to find a strain that will be most active against the pox viruses because it will lessen the cost of industrialization. And this is obviously in the public's interest. There's no market for antidotes or treatments against pox today. That's why I've entered into a contract with the U.S. government and the National Center for Natural Products Research doing biogated fractionation to try to determine the active constituents. To date, we've been unsuccessful. The natural extract is more active than any fractionated constituent that we've been able to pull out of these broths. It is totally non-toxic to humans. It's had a 2,000-year history of use. And so we have found something that the BioShield program has been quite surprised by, because they fully expected that the pharmaceutical companies, Merck, and these large pharmaceutical entities would have made this discovery. But I've received 2 phone calls from the BioShield program from the scientists there saying that people there are cheering for me because this is exactly what they had hoped. And I make the argument now that we should save the old-growth forest as a matter of national defense. And that is a bridge argument that is amending. You know, smallpox does not care if you're Republican or Democrat. You know, smallpox doesn't care about borders. And there is, unfortunately, a Machiavellian decision tree that has been created by the U.S. government, in that if there is an epidemic of smallpox, the strains have mutated and probably have by now, so we don't know if the previous vaccinations will be as effective. But if there is a presidential mandate because of the smallpox epidemic that all Americans become vaccinated, we have some huge problems. Not only is our society very plastic right now, we move around a lot, but we have a very large and increasingly large HIV-compromised population. With HIV and immunocompromised individuals, for them to take the smallpox vaccine, there is a much higher incidence of adverse reactions. So if you were HIV-compromised and you were told that you had to take this vaccine, but there was a significant threat to your health that you could have an adverse reaction and you would actually die from the very vaccine that you're taking, how many of the HIV-compromised population would take it? And unfortunately, they become, quote-unquote, typhoid Marys. They become potential sources of a highly virulent, contagious forms of smallpox. So this is a terrible scenario, but it is a scenario that the U.S. government and other governments around the world believe is real, and it is significant, and it's far better to think about this now, to come up with preventive remedies, and then trying to treat it after the fact. But treating after the fact is going to literally unravel the fabric of our society. And some of the big concerns that people even have about bird flu now. And if it's not smallpox, it could be bird flu. It could be SARS. Does anybody really think SARS has gone away? No. I mean, SARS was carried by civet cats. Civet cats eat birds. Birds carry bird flu and West Nile virus by the mosquitoes. All those viruses are being mixed up. And the potential of a viral epidemic appearing on the near horizon in our lifetime is a very real and poignant threat. All the more reason that we should look for alternative remedies and explore the natural world for compounds that can help prevent these disease vectors. That's one of dozens of examples that I can give you, but it's very salient, and I would encourage any listener to listen to the NPR.org interview, and that is smallpox agarikon press release vetted by the U.S. Defense Department. And if you punch in my name in Google, Stamets and smallpox, you can see it under a company called yet2.com, and that is a U.S. government-approved press release concerning my research.
So now one of your proposed solutions obviously is conserving our forests in the Northwest, and that kind of leads me to my next question, which is about the tropics. Now, as you've mentioned, you've spent many years isolating cultivars from the woods of the Pacific Northwest, and the biodiversity there pales in comparison to places like the Amazon. What do we know about edible species with tropical origins?
Well, there's not, surprisingly, as many edible mushrooms in the tropics as there are in the temperate regions of the world. The saprophytic fungi are operating at light speed, so to speak, in the tropics because there's not a winter to shut down or slow down the life cycles. But the biodiversity, for instance, or the mycodiversity in Hawaii pales in comparison to the mycodiversity in the Pacific Northwest. We have 4,000 to 6,000 species here in the Northwest, and Hawaii is in the hundreds. So it's hard to, as they say, paint the canvas with one brush. So some areas of the tropics are a lot more mycologically active in terms of the life cycles, but have less biodiversity. There's more edible mushrooms in temperate regions than there are in tropical regions. It's just the luck of the draw, so to speak. There are a lot more edible species in there's a longer tradition of eating edible mushrooms in the northern temperate regions than there are in the southern temperate regions. So there are pockets of knowledge that have evolved in civilizations, and experts and families tell others about the mushrooms that they enjoy, and so the body intellect in those cultures spreads out. Other areas that don't have as much populations, or for whatever reason they didn't discover that these mushrooms exist in their landscape, have a lot fewer or a lot less knowledge. But the fungi are on the march, and as global warming defrosts the temperate zone, then there's going to be an inevitable migration of temperate species into the Arctic regions, and similarly a migration of tropical species into the sub-temperate regions. The biodiversity of all organisms, I think, is part of and especially with fungi, these are essential elements in our biological tool chest. And when we lose these species, we're losing like rivets in an airplane that can lead to catastrophic failure. How many species will we lose before the entire system goes through a cataclysmic failure? And in doing so, species at the top of the food chain is obviously going to be greatly impacted, because the food chain is a sequence of microorganisms to macroorganisms. And that's being macroorganisms, if we don't have the microbes to help us in our food chains, we'll have nothing to eat. So this is all a very complex subject, but the whole concept of Gaia, and Gaia being one macroorganism composed of individuals, well, that concept mimics you and I today. I am Paul Stamets, speaking with one voice, but I'm a consortium of microbes that are unified together to create this body. And although I'm speaking with one voice, I am representing a constellation of microbes that are unified in symbiosis to speak to you and to your listeners. And so I think symbiosis is the way of nature. Nature loves partnerships. The partnerships are rewarded, and there are many, many examples. Here's one that I think is very cool. A group of scientists discovered the atine ants in North Africa, cultivate a Lepiota parasol mushroom. This mushroom is very large, is edible in choice, it gets to 2 to 3 feet in diameter. Well, the atine ants cultivate the mycelium in their nest, and the mycelium in their nest pre-selects a bacterium, and this bacterium produces an antibiotic that's active against Escovopsis. Escovopsis is a fungus that parasitizes ant colonies. And so the ants have learned through natural selection and evolution, and maybe just good luck, and by happenstance, that if they cultivate the mycelium of this mushroom, it produces the bacterium that produces the antibiotic that prevents another fungal infection that's dangerous to them. So the ants now become little mushroom cultivators, moving fragments of mycelium around. And that, I think, is one example that is a model upon which much of nature is based.
Now, speaking of using mushrooms to protect from something that's poisonous or toxic, talk about the use of mycelium in bioremediation, please.
Well, I have a new book, as you know. It's called Mycelium Running, How Mushrooms Can Help Save the World. And this book is on subtitle could be Myco-Restoration. Myco-Restoration contains 5 components: mycofiltration, the use of mycelium to filter out bacteria and microbes and silt into downstream environments, using the mycelium as a biological filter. There's mycoremediation, the breaking down of toxic waste, such as petroleum products, using the mycelial enzymes and acids that are very, very good at breaking down recalcitrant pollutants, especially petroleum-based ones. There's mycopesticides, or mycoinsecticides, which uses fungi to trick and kill termites and carpenter ants and other quote-unquote pest insects. I don't like that phrase, but that's what's used. And there's mycoforestry, the combination of mycelium to help forest ecosystems, myco-gardening, a combination of mycelium to help gardening. And those are the 5 pedestals of myco-restoration. And mycoremediation is something that I've focused on a lot for many years, and we did some experiments to break down petroleum diesel spills in Bellingham, Washington, with the Department of Transportation. and I worked with Battelle Laboratories for 4 or 5 years, BioShield Biodefense Program, we had got extremely strong hits against pox viruses, orthopoxes, which includes variola, smallpox. And this came as quite as a surprise, and we sent in many replicates. I think we have 31 reproducible results to date. And we have the stressing of the immune system of the habitats in which we live, the thinning of soils, and the loss of biodiversity. All those things play into the same game. So the research results came back, and a mushroom that we found that I focused on for many years called agarikon, first described by Dioscorides in 65 AD as a treatment against consumption, now an European method for making teas. The wood conchs we boiled in water were not active, so people shouldn't go out and collect this really rare mushroom. It's extremely rare. We need to preserve its biodiversity. But it's the mycelium that I grew in a specialized way in the laboratory. We have now 13 strains of this species and been selected as having the 2 of the top 6 hits against smallpox, like viruses, were chosen by the BioShield program. 2 of those 6 were my samples of Fomitopsis officinalis. Now, it's not the wood conch that you boil in water, which is the traditional Chinese in Europe has tuberculosis. Indeed, it is active against tuberculosis. Agaricon's Latin name is Fomitopsis officinalis. It's exclusive to the old-growth forests of the Northwest, Washington, Oregon, Northern California, British Columbia. It is now thought to be extinct over most regions of Europe, where it was first described over 2,000 years ago. When I sent in samples of this to